Hey, my name's Kyle Daniels. I'm the head of marketing at Assimilate, and we've been working with the guys at IBM to bring you some amazing content on data governance and AI. We hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about data governance in the age of the Internet of Things and big data. So before we get into that side of things, I think for the audience, especially for me, what do we mean when we say the Internet of Things?
So for me, the Internet of Things, just in a layman's term, is, out there we have a huge amount of devices and sensors in everything we do, whether it be cars these days, whether it be some fridges that you buy, devices around your house, but probably more importantly, certainly in industry, devices around any of the assets that you have within industry. We're even seeing devices embedded in things like bridges, to manage stress and things like that. And so the Internet of Things is basically all around those things, as it were, producing data that then gives us insight. So in the case of, the example I mentioned earlier, the bridge, we're able to analyze the stresses in the bridge, analyze the cracks, understand those cracks in a better way, but then recommend courses of proactive maintenance that have expanded the bridge life. This is in the Nordics, by 30 to 50 years, because we understand a lot more about that bridge. Now, if you think about the past, we'd have looked at the bridge, some very experienced engineer would have looked up at the bridge and said, well, you might need to run less cars over there or stop the trucks going. But the point now is we're able to do that in a very scientific way. But across industry, that data is really valuable. I think the challenge with that data is understanding, because it's coming thick and fast in real time, in very much stream data, is understanding what you need to capture, why you need to capture it, and what you need to do with it. Because inevitably, because it's fast moving, has the event moved past criticality? You're tracking an event. Has it already happened? Is it relevant or not?
Classic examples, so smart cars, well, no, never mind smart cars, the amount of devices you've got within any car that's produced today. One of those IoT devices is measuring when the airbag goes off, and every hundredth of a second you get a value of zero. Don't care about, there's only one I care about, is when it went from 0 to 1. Yeah, so there's a huge amount of data being produced. Yeah. But only one bit is of valid, of value.
And then the next stage you want to do is how, in more complex cases, how do you marry that stream data with static data to really start to provide business insight, as it pertains to an outcome. And that's quite complex in terms of not just capturing the data, but understanding the data and doing something in an appropriate time scale to provide insight, and it's quite a big challenge. But asset, and it's used mainly, certainly in IBM, we have a big division that use it, our sustainability does, to use it for proactive maintenance, even to the extent of not, we should maintain this in 3 months, but actually, if we do this now, it'll be more effective, or actually we don't need to do anything for 3 months, so why don't we do something with a bigger priority? All of that data comes, from real-time sensors, understanding the nature of that asset, which is a more static thing. I know I've got a thing stood there. That doesn't change, but the data it produces is changing all of the time. So it's actually that correlation and capturing the data at the right time, and to your point, capturing the one, not all of the noughts, that becomes relevant.
We talk about a vast amount of data then, because if you talk about, even just with a car, you mentioned one thing, but I imagine there's a lot.
Oh, yeah.
How are you managing that, especially if we talk about real time? How does that even happen?
Well, let's talk about big data.
Okay.
Big data is a phrase that has been used or misused, I think, an awful lot over the last few years. And to me, big data simply is more data than you're used to handling. Okay. So if all you do is work on a spreadsheet, then 100,000 rows is big data. Because I don't know if you've used a spreadsheet with 100,000 rows, but it's a pretty clunky thing. Yeah. Put 100,000 rows into a relational database, you wouldn't know it's there. It's just instant. So it depends on the tools that you're using and your organisation, your experience as to whether it's big or small. So for some organisations, 10 gigabytes of data is quite big data. For like a telco, a terabyte of data an hour is business as usual. A petabyte is big data. So it really depends on what you're doing, what your experience is, and particularly what tools you've got to run it as to whether it's big or not.
Okay.
And we've had experience of the tools, actually affecting, because ultimately it's not how much data you can store, the big bit, to the tools bit. If you need to run a report in 3 hours and it's taking 14 hours because you're doing the wrong thing, big data doesn't help you. How it's stored doesn't. It really is about the tools and what you're trying to achieve and how timely that is. We've both had personal experience of that, haven't we?
Indeed.
Felt there's a story in there. But for the morbid curiosity in me, where are those times where that's failed, where all that data coming in and there's been that failure point? Are there some kind of big tentpole examples that maybe have been out there in the wild that we have just seen but never even put the two and two together?
Look, without calling things out, because obviously, let's respect our customers, but I do think there are things about big data that inevitably cause problems. Dumping stuff in there. I mean, we've said through everything, it's really important to know why you're storing data, not just storing it. Just moving, and there is a big movement in our customers, in our marketplace to, you have a new analytics use case. Let's create a new data store and move everything in there. But then once we've got that data store, then we'll have data scientists and data analysts looking at it, changing it, putting it back in, including all of the tests and the stuff they've got. So big data doesn't necessarily mean big useful data. It can mean big chunks of rubbish that then you have a really big problem managing. And for me, that's where governance comes in, because if you can't govern big data, it's probably just like, my kids' wardrobe, which they just chuck stuff in, and when you say we leave in 10 minutes, they can't find their clothes because there's so much in there, and most of it's the wrong size because they haven't cleared it out for a year and a half.
But we went from a world of data warehouses where data was pretty well highly curated. People knew what they were doing, they loaded the data in. But they took time and care overloading the data in so that it was good quality data and everything. When the world of big data and Hadoop and everything came on, one of the proposed values of that type of environment was that you didn't have to spend all of that time structuring the data to get it in the first place. You chuck the data in, and then you could structure it as and when you needed to. Of course, what that meant was the vast majority of people just chucked lots of data in and then forgot it was there. And so people joked about, it's a data swamp, not a data lake. But the reality is that if you're going to keep data, you need to think about the value of that data. And not all data has the same value. There's a small amount of in any organisation, you've got a relatively small amount of financial and client data that is fundamental to that business. If you lose that, the business, you're out of business. You think of some of the organisations that lost machine rooms in 9/11. They lost people, but they also lost data, and they could never recover from that. But that was a small amount of data. And then you get these, bigger volumes of data, where there is some value. I'm not saying it's worthless. There is some value in it, but if you like, the density of that value is much, much lower. And so you need to be able to understand the data to be able to understand how best to handle it.
Okay.
And also how to handle it cost effectively.
Gemma, one thing that sticks in my mind is do you think big data still has a a place alongside lake houses, and do lake houses start to solve some of that value alongside governance?
Before you answer that, quickly, what's a lake house? I'm just thinking because the people that are watching this
No.
keep hearing data warehouse, lakes, and so on.
So the data warehouse historically was very structured data. So typically it sat in a relational database, and it was very...
We'll look to Brendan like, yep, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Well, you're the expert. Yeah. I'm merely guessing.
And what I just talked about, a data lake where
Yeah.
the data didn't need to be structured, it was all sort of chucked in. One of the downsides of that, even if you know the data's there, the access to it was never fast.
Okay.
So you might throw a lot of resources, but you're not going to get sort of second level or sub-second response times in querying that data.
Okay.
It's going to take hours. And a data lakehouse is taking those two sort of ideas and putting it together so that you effectively have a much better performing but much broader set of data without the constraints of having to put it into a relational database. So, and the lakehouse does address some of the performance issues with that, and hence the manageability of the data once it's in there, but it doesn't inherently manage the data governance issue. And so you still need, whether you're in a lake house or a lake or
Or a beach house. Like, that'll be the next thing that comes.
you still need to govern the data.
But it does give you some advantages of where you store data and its cost.
And being able to get that, we talked about the value of the data, which varies. Yeah. And because the value of the data varies, and therefore the performance and whatever you need out of a certain amount of data varies, what a data lakehouse does is, with different options, you can store the data in different places and get different performance out of it. You can query it with different engines and get different performance out of it. So it gives you a lot more flexibility and gives you the ability to get to the point of being able to match the performance of the system to the actual requirements of the business.
And when you say it's missing that data governance connector, really, do you feel like that's probably the next thing? Like the business, the company, the whatever that manages to do that is really onto something?
Yes.
Like obviously no pressure for IBM.
What you mean, like we're already on it, yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, it's critical, isn't it? You've got to understand your data. That round tripping, you've got to understand how the data's changed. And I think critically, then the question, whether big data is still a thing or not comes to light. And the second question is I think the world we're in running things where it matters and having no data latency is about being able to do that where it matters. So it's not just about necessarily loading all your data onto the cloud. Sometimes it's about putting it in edge devices or on premise and being able to have that option. And I think, where we've taken our evolution of big data through to lake houses is in a hybrid sense, so on premise. I think that's pretty important to our customers.
And I think, at the risk of contradicting myself from earlier, where size really does matter is you can't keep, when you get to a certain size, you can't keep saying, oh, I'm going to put it in a new bucket. This bucket's shiny, I'm going to put everything in there. If it's a few, tens of gigabytes or whatever, no problem. If it's a couple of petabytes, that is a big, big job. And so being able to leave data where it is, whether that's right or wrong, is something we could debate at a different time. But being able to still access and query the data wherever it is fundamentally important. And that's where data virtualization and as part of a data fabric story then becomes really important.
It's interesting because we've got customers that are concerned about duplication, yet they're moving data. And if you think, as I maintain, data isn't about a database, it's created in an application. Those enterprise applications exist on premise, and let's say they move the data to the cloud. They don't delete the data on premise. It's still funneling data day in, day out to the cloud. So you've got transporting that data constantly and transforming it, or landing it and transforming it. You've also got to monitor it, or you should monitor it, although from my experience, lots of people move it and they're happy and never worry about monitoring. So that's another quality issue for the whatever repository you put it in the cloud. And because we've gone through evolutions, and it doesn't matter about the vendor really, you end up with duplication everywhere. So now you have a massive quality and provenance problem of, it goes back to saying, I get this data is transformed from A to B to C, but which one do I trust? And actually the answer might be all three, it might be one of them, depending on how it's been transformed and by who, for what reason. And so it makes navigating your data more complex. And this is the reality. One of my colleagues has got a very nice chart that you've seen, which shows an architecture. And honestly, it looks like a massive accident of systems holding data. And you think, how on earth does anyone operate their business in this type of environment? It's all because of, over the years, new shiny repository based on new analytics use case, and this is where governance starts to help out, virtualization, and actually being able to make the decision about whether you move data or you leave it where it is. And if you're moving data, why are you moving it, and for what reason? And is it about moving it to where it needs because it matters? And then importantly, if you're going to move it and it's going to be in contact, constantly being able to monitor the relationship and the pipelines that lead to that.
When you're talking about managing the data and moving it and whatnot, do you find that once the GDPR, I know it makes me shiver saying the word.
You're in marketing, it would
exactly, yeah, it kills me. Do you feel like those regulations coming in probably scared some people and then made people panic a little bit about the data and what they were holding and where they were storing it, and people started moving it?
Do you know, it's funny, I think when there was fear to start off with, but then we also saw quite a lot of companies going, well, as long as we're not the worst.
Like an ambivalence about, someone else is worse.
Let's wait to see who gets caught. And how big the cost is, because the cost of fixing it is potentially too big. And I think people have now got to the point of going, well, do you know what? We can't afford not to do it. And I'm not just talking about the regulation. It's like we've been talking about. It's the reputational risk of not doing it.
Some very public
has really. I think that has taken. Has driven the behaviour more than anything.
If it takes you 2 months to pull up a subject matter request from one person very publicly, that's a reputational risk. But then equally, if you're handling 100 of those a week and it's costing you XYZ to support each of those requests because you don't know where your data is, it starts to become a business problem, because that doesn't scale financially. And I think that faces a lot of companies out there which have taken the approach of, we'll wait and see. If I can't fulfill, we're talking about every email, every record, across that smorgasbord of that becomes a complicated thing to do, just to comply with a request. So actually mechanizing that starts to become a thing that certainly companies are thinking about in the GDPR space. And I think most of all is then really that, accidental privacy breach that occasionally rears its ugly head. And governance helps a lot with that, assuming that the governance pipeline is controlling the data and that someone hasn't gone left of field and, the spreadsheet is the classic answer, but had their own little Access database sat on a desktop somewhere and managed it, done their own data engineering, and then what you find is that shadow IT can cause something that's much more of a corporate level issue. Right?
And it's a good comment really, because I think the audience will probably want some practical advice of going out of this and what they can do. So are there things that people can be looking out for in terms of, if people do have their own little mini databases going on, little spreadsheets that they're managing, and that data silo is everywhere, no one's really having that conversation, before they get to the data governance bit, is there something they can do internally?
Awareness is the first thing. So, we in IBM, every year we have to sign up to say that we've read through our business conduct guidelines, but also a whole set of stuff around data security, and now that includes AI as well.
Yeah.
About to make sure that everybody is aware of the dangers in having data that they shouldn't have, and they're aware of the risks of cyber attacks and all the rest of it. And instead of it being the domain of some specialists within IT, really, I think we're at the level now where all of the community within an organisation has, we all use these devices. We all have some awareness of it. Let's make sure that people take some responsibility themselves in this space.
I think Gemma makes a really good point here, and I think it's relevant to all of our discussions that we have within an organisation. Not everything is solved by technology. I'm a technologist, and it's really easy to fall into that trap. A good structure of corporate governance to support the technology is vital. Classic case a colleague of ours used to talk about was, the requirement for having a national insurance number at a certain organisation. So what the person who took the call used to do was just write in any number. So they decided to put sort of force them to put a national. So what did they do? Put their own national insurance number in there. Now it's really difficult to enforce anything through the technology, but starting to get people to understand the importance of doing the right thing and what the knock-on effect is how you govern that. And I think it's the same with rules and regulations around data. Shadow IT, yeah, sure, you can go around doing investigations and spending loads of money. But I think that, setting rules and regulations that people understand and standards, and literally explaining and educating as to the reason behind, because it can't all be stick. It has to be, carrot, and helping people understand helps. Now, obviously, there still will be people who go outside that, but then they're breaching corporate guidelines.
A great example was a few years back now, one of the banks, they were doing some analysis of mortgage applications. Surprising number of Argentinian astronauts. That's because, what was the first country in the drop-down list? What was the first job in the drop-down list?
Argentinian astronauts.
Absolute classic. Guys, we could probably go on and talk about this for a long time, but we are running out of time. So I suppose just the final quick one, really. What future trends do you see emerging in Internet of Things and big data that probably you guys are excited about?
Internet of Things, we've been talking about AI. Seeing AI coming into Internet of Things, I think, is where, in some ways, some people might see it as scary, but I think that's going to be a fascinating area. Having, basically natural language controlled devices in your house. Yeah, I mean, we always have that to some extent with Alexa and the like now, but much more than that.
Yeah, and I think in both of those areas there's some interesting things. Some of the stuff we've done with NASA in terms of taking satellite imagery, looking at the effect on the planet. You could argue that that's now instrumenting things that say, how my trees in Africa, for example, where they're replanting trees, is that helping with reforestation, which is a big thing. When we look at the kind of big data lakehouse world, what I'm really excited about is this growing awareness between the need to govern data and store it, I think is emerging to a point where for years I've been talking to chief data officers and they've been talking about data culture and use of data and data is oil and all of those cliches. But the really important thing is, we're emerging to a point where we're going to have to make data consumable or not. And I think really we're at the cusp of being able to do that. And I mean, that might not be exciting in the whole scheme of things, but that interests me because what is there we could discover and do better when we can really understand the data we have spent millions storing over the years and really don't use.
Guys, thank you so much for your time today. That was really insightful. Thank you. We'll see you next time.